Let's recreate this book cover in 3D. Okay, I mean, do I even need to explain myself? I think I read Goosebumps 10% for the stories and 90% because of the cover art. These classic covers are absolutely legendary, and I got reminded of them last week and I was like, man, I wonder what it would be like to recreate this in 3D. I mean, modeling wise, it's pretty straightforward, but a good practice nonetheless. But the textures, how do you even really get this type of painted texture? It's not like super brushy or watercolory. The painted effect is actually kind of subtle, and there's a high level of realism, but it's still obviously painted. I don't know, it was an interesting challenge. So I took it. I looked at some of the classic books I grew up on, and as soon as I saw this one, I knew this was gonna be it. This was my favorite cover. It's just so iconic, so perfectly executed. And as a kid, I kind of just had the thing with hands. I don't know, I would draw hands a lot and I was kind of fascinated by them, so this one stuck to me the most. Don't get me wrong, there are other legendary ones like Monster Blood 2, Ghost Beach, A Night in Terror Tower, The Girl Who Cried Monster, You Can't Scare Me. Man, those yellow tones are ingrained in my head. And other ones too. Sometimes the faces would look kind of off, so I would kind of gravitate more towards the ones that don't really have human faces. But now thinking about it, it's really crazy how much the covers made me connect to this series of books more than other series like, I don't know, Animorphs or Fear Street, or I don't even remember what else I was reading at the time. And that's all thanks to Tim Jacobus, the artist who created these covers. Man, those original painted pieces exist out there somewhere, and I'm just thinking how fucking crazy it would be to have an original framed in my house. And just to get it out of the way, I hated the TV show. It was a disgrace. It was shameful. It was just so badly made, it's sad. I was just slightly too old and skeptic when it came out, but I was still young enough and excited enough for it, and I was down to watch it, but it wasn't good. Oh god, it was just hideous. Anyway, yeah. I wasn't even expecting to get this one perfectly because I really had no idea how to achieve this. I thought at some point maybe I should make it super realistic. And maybe it's still a good idea, but I really wanted to nail that painterly look. But first, we need to get the models. So I polymodeled the door stuff in Cinema, because I'm much better at hard surface modeling in Cinema, and then went on to ZBrush to sculpt the hand. I thought the best way to block out the hand would be using Z-spheres so I can get the position and kind of main shape right. I obviously focused more on the fingers and back of the palm and all these visible parts you see. I've noticed that I should start with a way thinner base because I find it more natural to sculpt in an additive way where I add details on top of the topology. So if I start from a thick object, it gets thicker and thicker as I sculpt and kind of doesn't look as good. And it happened here with the tip of the fingers, where I ended up with the tips of the fingers being much thicker than the original painting. But I noticed it way too late and didn't want to go back and do everything all over again. Honestly, not a crazy huge deal, just something I noticed. One thing I definitely wanted to make sure I do this time is to really take my time with each level of details. I mean, obviously, first is to get the anatomy right, and that's just something you kind of learn with experience and attention to anatomy. I bought this anatomy book and watched a few videos on anatomy of the hand, and it helped, but I can't expect to get great anatomy right away. But beyond that, what I notice professional sculptors do is get so much done way before subdividing the fuck out of the model. I think as a beginner, you tend to subdivide too fast and rush into higher levels of details, but really, look at someone who knows what they're doing and you'll see that they spend a ton of time in low-res topology getting the primary and secondary levels of details. It's just a matter of training your eye to be able to see tiny differences in the curvature of your model and how to get good low and mid-level detail. What's cool about that is that I've noticed that doing it this way helps you develop way better higher levels of details because you kind of start to notice stuff forming in your topology just from the different brush strokes you make and the way they kind of build up and take shape. And all you need to do is just accentuate those shapes and give them more detail instead of like inventing that detail. Maybe I'm not really being clear about what I'm trying to say here, but if you jump into the higher levels of details too soon, it's like getting to that level with an empty canvas. So you kind of need to make them up from nothing. But if you slowly build the foundation and then keep building slowly, you'll start to form all these rudimentary shapes in your topology that then you can kind of detail further and further. They kind of inspire you where to go and which direction to take those shapes and what type of details you want to form out of them. Before I was getting to the extremely fine details, which, mind you, I obviously wasn't going for pores or fine wrinkles or anything like that because it would look too real. I duplicated the model, remeshed it, and projected the details. Obviously, I didn't really need perfect low poly topology, but I always prefer it. First of all, so I don't end up with a super dense model that will slow down my viewport when I'm texturing or rendering, but also because it's way easier to UV unwrap a low poly, decent topology model. Then I move on to sculpt the final details on the retopologized model at high subdivision levels. I think one thing I still need to really work on and get better at is finding the balance between good detail and too much detail. I noticed that I tend to add way too much detail to literally everything, and too much detail kind of hides the details in a way. Like anything else in your work, you need contrast to make it work visually. And in terms of details, it means having parts that have less details and parts that have more. But I tend to just pour the same amount and style of details on everything, and then I zoom out and I'm like, damn, that's way too much. I think it's just a common beginner's problem when you overcompensate for the lack of good foundations or just lack of confidence in your model. I tried to match the look and placement of the leaves as much as I could, but honestly, I should have just used the image plane in the back to perfectly match the look. The problem is that here I'm using a camera with a fixed focal length, and the painting obviously doesn't. So I thought to myself that there's no real point of matching the focal length perfectly. I'm just gonna try and get as close as possible. And eventually I hit pretty close by using a very long lens. But looking back, I should have just used an image plane in the back, used a parallel lens in ZBrush because that's almost the same as the painting, which kind of doesn't have any perspective distortion, and then try and really get as perfectly matching framing as I could. Then I UV unwrapped everything in Cinema. Looking back, I'm thinking it might have been easier if all the leaves were in a single object, but on the other hand, having each leaf as a single object makes it easier to move each one around. Then it was time for what at that point felt like the truly challenging part. I started with as much procedural work as I could, curvature paintings, and slapping a bunch of noises on everything. Beyond that, I just kept trying different art brushes to get some feel of a subtle brushstroke. Again, even if you zoom in on the painting, it's not like you can see each individual brushstroke like in an oil painting or water paint. I read an interview with Tim Jacobus, the artist behind these paintings, and he said that he used acrylic paint with sable brushes and airbrush to smooth it out. So yeah, I just kept moving from different brushes, mostly from the Kyle's brush set. Another confusing thing I was trying to figure out was, should I fully paint in the light and shadows? Do I let the actual lighting in the scene do that work? I knew that painting in the shadows and highlights will help make it look more painterly, but also, I mean, we're still in the 3D world, so what's the point? On the other hand, if I let the lighting do all the work, then I'm gonna lose a lot of the painted effect. I ended up kind of finding a nice middle ground. I definitely wanted to paint in those very subtle blue highlights on the hand, because that was a huge part of the look in the painting, at least for me. If you like this content and want to support the channel, feel free to check out my Patreon or membership, where you can find these project files, watch these videos with no ads, get free products from the store, as well as other cool perks, but mostly help me make more and better content for y'all. Also, you can buy this model, as well as other material and model packs on my new plastic Gumroad, and also buy prints and pins I made on the pink eye Gumroad. And I totally understand that not everyone can support that way, but even subscribing helps the channel, or giving me a follow on Instagram at ojang or the channel at brandnewplastic. And if you want to help build a community, share your work, and just fuck around, join our Discord. I'll leave the link in the description. Either way, I really appreciate you. I wasn't really sure how it was going until I worked on the doorknob. Once I was done with that doorknob, I kind of started feeling really good about the whole thing. Like the doorknob truly felt hand painted for me here. Like that fall off between the highlight and the shadows really felt good to me. At the end of the day, the key thing to make it look painted is to really lean into the brush strokes, like do short and layered strokes instead of painting in large areas at a time, and to keep layering more and more strokes with different shades and even different colors. Like the doorknob, I used these beige gold tones, but added in subtle splashes of orange and red, and then just used a smudge tool to kind of blend them together. Same for the hand. I used this base green shade, but kept layering in more yellows in certain parts and more turquoise cyan tones in other parts. Brushing, smudging, and at some point it starts to really take form. There's obviously a lot of color theory here, so it works if you understand how to layer colors correctly, but trial and error goes a long way. Then I actually had a separate project for the door frame, that wall, and those 3 leaves. I don't know why I separated them. It didn't make much of a difference. On the door frame, I actually used some bump texture. It's very subtle because I didn't want to rely on it too much for detail. I wanted to get the details mostly from the albedo channel because, you know, painting. But just very subtly bumping down the edges to kind of add some imperfection or add some cracks in actually worked out great. Then I put everything together in Cinema, and it was just a matter of getting the framing right. Like I said, I ended up using a camera with like 300mm focal length to really flatten out the perspective, rotated it around to give it that Dutch angle, and I really absolutely loved how the textures came out. So it was just a matter of finding the best way to light it. There seemed to be a bit too much contrast, so I tried to play with lowering the light intensity and upping the overall exposure or adding more lights. I ended up going back and forth to Substance to kind of darken certain textures or shift their hues. I noticed that adding the light makes the highlights that I painted in too bright, so I made the highlights on the door and the fingers a bit darker. Also, I also ended up changing the view transform to AGX since it has much less contrast and fit the painted look better. The last thing I struggled with was to nail those shadows on the door. I wanted to get the light to cast them as close to the painting as possible, but there was no real way to do it and make it look good. I just had to compromise a bit and settled for this look. But actually, eventually, I went back and quickly painted in those shadows because I didn't want to compromise. I wanted those shadows, damn it. Then after very subtle color adjustment and adding a bit more texture in post, this is the final result. I mean, there's obvious flaws in it, mainly the fingers and some composition detail, but man, this came out crazy good in my opinion. I think the most important thing is that it feels like the cover for me, and that's all I could ask for. It's a 3D scene that feels like a painting, that reminds me of my childhood. Young guy, going to the local library, and hoping for a new color to pop out of the children horror bookshelf, symbolizing a new book in the series ready to be mostly looked at and admired, forever solidifying the not verbalized but definitely heartfelt realization that I was really more of a fan of Tim Jacobus than R.L. Stine. I'll put up this model, ZBrush tool, and Substance Painter project on my Gumroad if you want it, or check out the prints and pins I made on my other Gumroad, or consider supporting on Patreon or membership to get these project files for free, because you already know I wouldn't have been able to make these videos without the help of these cute little monsters on my Patreon and membership. I love you. Have a great day. Peace.
tick, tick.